The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of wood as the evening chill settled into its bones. Lucas sat in his study, the room dimly lit by the soft glow of a desk lamp. He stared at the photograph on his desk. A picture of him and Alina on their wedding day. Her radiant smile had captivated him from the moment they met, and on that day, he had been certain their love was unshakable. But tonight, that certainty was gone. Alina had been distant for months, her laughter less frequent, her touch mechanical. She blamed work, the stress of managing high-profile marketing accounts. But Lucas wasn't convinced. The long hours, the sudden trips, the unexplained expenses, all of it felt too convenient, too scripted. He thought back to earlier that evening. They had sat across from each other at the dinner table, a meal of grilled salmon and asparagus growing cold between them. "You've been working a lot lately," Lucas had said, keeping his tone neutral. Alina looked up from her plate, her expression carefully composed. "It's the new client. They're demanding, but it'll settle down soon." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Lucas nodded, pushing the food around his plate. He wanted to believe her, but the evidence to the contrary was piling up. The receipt had been the tipping point. A week ago, he had found it tucked into the glove compartment of Elena's car, a handwritten bill from a boutique hotel downtown. Suite 412, 2 guests. She had dismissed it easily when he asked. "It's for work," she had said with a wave of her hand. "We rented the suite for the client's team, nothing exciting." He had nodded, pretending to believe her, but now, as he sat in the solitude of his study, the doubt gnawed at him. Lucas reached for his phone and opened the browser. His fingers hesitated over the search bar before typing, "Private Investigator Services near me." The next morning, Lucas met Ethan Cole in a small cafe on the edge of town. Ethan was a man of few words, his grizzled face and sharp eyes giving the impression of someone who had seen it all. "You think she's cheating?" Ethan asked bluntly, sipping his black coffee. Lucas flinched at the word, but he nodded. "I don't know for sure. I need to know." Ethan nodded. "Give me everything you've got, her routine, places she goes, anyone she might be spending time with." Lucas slid a notebook across the table. It contained a week's worth of observations. Elena's late-night client dinners, her frequent trips to the gym, the names of a few colleagues she had mentioned in passing. Ethan flipped through the pages, his expression unreadable. "I'll get started. You'll hear from me in a week." Lucas watched him leave, a heavy weight settling in his chest. He had crossed a line, but he couldn't turn back now. It took less than a week for Ethan to deliver his first report. They met again in the same cafe, and Ethan handed Lucas a manila folder. "She's been busy," he said, his tone neutral. Lucas opened the folder with trembling hands. The photographs inside showed Elena sitting in a dimly lit restaurant, her face lit with laughter. Across from her sat a man Lucas didn't recognize, tall, sharply dressed, with an easy smile. "Victor Langston," Ethan said, tapping the photo. "Senior executive at her firm, married, no kids." Lucas flipped through the rest of the photos. There was one of them leaving the restaurant together, Victor's hand resting lightly on Elena's back as they walked to his car. Lucas felt his chest tighten. "How long?" "Based on what I've seen, a few months, but that's not all." Ethan slid another set of photos across the table. These were taken at the gym Elena had recently joined. In them, she was with her personal trainer, a younger man with a muscular build and a cocky grin. They were laughing, their body language unmistakably close. "Andrew West," Ethan said, "works at the gym full-time. Single. 2 men, 2 betrayals." Lucas stared at the evidence, his mind reeling. He had suspected something was wrong, but this was more than he could have imagined. That evening, Lucas waited for Elena to return home. The photographs lay on the coffee table, a silent indictment. When she walked through the door, she looked surprised to see him waiting. "You're home early," she said, setting her bag down. "We need to talk," Lucas said, his voice tight. Elena hesitated, her eyes flicking to the coffee table. She froze when she saw the photographs. "What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You tell me," Lucas said. Her eyes filled with tears as she sank onto the couch. "It's not what it looks like," she whispered. "Really?" Lucas snapped. "Because it looks like you've been lying to me. 2 men, Elena. 2 affairs." How long have you been doing this?" "I didn't mean for it to happen," she sobbed. "I was lonely, Lucas. I felt invisible. And you thought cheating was the solution." "I didn't plan it," she said, her voice breaking. "Victor was a mistake, I swear. But Andrew made me feel alive again." Lucas stared at her, his anger giving way to a cold, hollow ache. "You've destroyed us," he said. The days that followed were a blur of anger and confusion. Lucas couldn't sleep, his mind racing with images of Elena and the 2 men who had taken his place. He met with Ethan again, determined to confront both Victor and Andrew. "I need to see them," Lucas said. Ethan frowned. That's risky." "I don't care." Victor Langston's office was exactly what Lucas expected. Sleek, modern, and designed to intimidate. Glass walls showcased the city skyline, while expensive artwork adorned the remaining spaces. Victor was sitting behind a large mahogany desk, his tailored suit and confident demeanor radiating success. He looked up as Lucas entered, confusion flickering across his face. "Lucas, right?" Victor asked. "Elena's husband?" Lucas didn't bother to sit. He pulled a photo from the folder he had brought and slid it across the desk. "Oh!" Victor's face paled as he picked it up. It was a candid shot of him and Elena leaving the restaurant, his hand on her lower back. "How long?" Lucas asked, his voice low but laced with fury. Victor placed the photo face down on the desk and sighed. "I didn't know she was married at first," he admitted. "When I found out, I told her we should stop." "But you didn't," Lucas said coldly. "No," Victor replied, his voice tinged with regret. "She said things were over between you two. I believed her." "You should have known better," Lucas snapped. Victor held up a hand. "Look, I made a mistake. I won't see her again. You have my word." Lucas glared at him for a long moment before turning to leave. "If you break that promise, you'll regret it." Andrew West was easy to find. Lucas waited for him in the parking lot of the gym, leaning against his car as members filtered out for the evening. Andrew finally appeared, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder, his cocky grin firmly in place. "You, Andrew?" Lucas asked, stepping forward. "Who's asking?" Andrew replied, raising an eyebrow. "I'm Elena's husband." Andrew froze for a moment, then shrugged. "Ah, well, this is awkward." Lucas's jaw tightened. "How long have you been seeing her?" Andrew smirked. "You mean sleeping with her?" "A few months. She came to me, said she wasn't getting what she needed at home." Rage flared in Lucas's chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. "It ends now." Andrew laughed. "And what if it doesn't? You think she's going to just forget about me because you tell her to?" Without warning, Lucas grabbed Andrew by the collar, shoving him against the nearest car. The smirk disappeared from Andrew's face. "You're done," Lucas growled. "Stay away from her, or I swear you'll regret it." Andrew nodded quickly, his bravado crumbling. Fine, it's over." Lucas released him, stepping back. "Make sure it is." When Lucas returned home that night, he found Elena sitting in the living room, her face pale and drawn. She had been crying. The evidence was clear in her swollen eyes and the tissues scattered around her. "You talked to them, didn't you?" she asked as he entered. "I did," Lucas said, his voice cold. "And they had plenty to say." Elena looked down at her hands, twisting them in her lap. "I'm sorry, Lucas. I never wanted this to happen." "Then why did it?" he demanded. "Why 2 men? Why lie to me for months?" Elena's voice broke as she replied, "Because I felt alone. You were so wrapped up in your work, your routine. I didn't feel seen anymore." "And you thought the solution was to destroy our marriage?" "I didn't think," she admitted, tears streaming down her face. "I was selfish. I know that. But I still love you, Lucas. Please believe me." Lucas stared at her, his heart a mix of anger, betrayal, and the faintest flicker of the love they once shared. "You don't destroy someone you love," he said finally. Despite Elena's tearful confession, Lucas wasn't ready to forgive her. He needed more answers about her motivations, about how far the lies had gone. Ethan's investigation continued, revealing more pieces of Elena's double life. Hotel receipts, text messages, even a second phone hidden in her car. Each new discovery felt like a fresh wound, cutting deeper than the last. Lucas began to piece together a timeline, a map of deceit that stretched back over a year. He realized that Elena had been juggling these affairs with meticulous precision, compartmentalizing her life in a way that left him questioning everything he thought he knew about her. One evening, as Lucas sat in his study, Elena knocked softly on the door. "Can I come in?" she asked hesitantly. He gestured for her to enter but said nothing. "I started seeing a therapist," she said, her voice quiet. "I know it doesn't change what I've done, but I want to try to understand why I did it, and I want to try to fix us." Lucas looked at her, searching her face for any sign of manipulation. Instead, he saw genuine regret. "I don't know if we can be fixed," he said honestly, "but I guess that's a start." As weeks turned into months, Lucas and Elena began to rebuild. Though the process was anything but smooth, trust was fragile, and every argument threatened to unravel the progress they had made. There were moments, however, when Lucas glimpsed the woman he had fallen in love with. A shared laugh, a gentle touch, a spark of connection that hadn't been there in years. But the shadows of her betrayal loomed large, and Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, pieces of the puzzle that still didn't fit. Lucas found himself awake late one night, unable to sleep despite the relative peace in the house. The ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway was the only sound, its rhythmic chime marking the passing of time that felt both too fast and excruciatingly slow. He stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. Despite Elena's promises of therapy and change, he couldn't shake the weight of what he had discovered. The 2 men, Victor and Andrew, had been just part of a larger pattern. It wasn't just the betrayal of her body, but of their shared life, their trust. He got out of bed quietly, careful not to wake Elena, and went to his study. The investigator's files were still on his desk, and he opened them again, studying each piece of evidence like it was a puzzle. Why had she kept the second phone? What else had she been hiding? And most importantly, had she truly stopped? The second phone, which Lucas had found hidden in Elena's car, became an obsession. It was locked with a passcode, but Lucas had always been observant. After a few attempts, he tried the date of their wedding, and the phone unlocked with a soft click. The messages were damning. Conversations with Victor and Andrew were still there, though the tone had shifted. Victor's messages had grown colder, more transactional, while Andrew's were increasingly desperate. "Andrew, why are you ignoring me? You said you needed me." "Victor, we both know this isn't sustainable. "It's over, Elena." But it wasn't just the two of them. There were other numbers, other names, some saved, some anonymous. Conversations that hinted at meetings, at gifts exchanged, at more lies. Lucas's chest tightened as he realized the full extent of her deception. This wasn't just a moment of weakness. This was a lifestyle. The next morning, Lucas confronted Elena with the phone. He placed it on the kitchen counter as she made coffee, the screen still lit with one of her damning messages. "Care to explain this?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. Elena froze, the coffee pot trembling in her hand. Slowly, she set it down and turned to face him. "Where did you get that?" she whispered. "Does it matter?" Lucas snapped. "You lied to me, again." Tears welled in her eyes, but Lucas was unmoved. How many, Elena? How many lies? How many men? "I don't know," she said, her voice breaking. "It wasn't about them. It was about me. I was lost." "That's not an excuse," Lucas said coldly. "You destroyed everything." Despite his anger, Lucas couldn't bring himself to leave. That night, as they lay in bed, the silence between them was deafening. Elena reached for him hesitantly, her touch tentative. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," she said softly, "but I miss you, Lucas. I miss us." Her hand brushed against his chest, her fingers tracing the lines of his body. Despite himself, Lucas felt his resolve waver. There was something raw, almost desperate in her touch. "I don't know if I can trust you," he admitted, his voice heavy. "I'll earn it back," she whispered, her lips brushing against his neck. It had been months since they had been this close, and Lucas couldn't deny the pull he still felt toward her. Their bodies moved together, hesitant at first, then with the intensity of rekindled passion. But as the night wore on, the weight of her betrayal lingered, even in the intimacy they shared. The next day, Lucas met with Ethan again. The investigator's expression was grim as he handed over another file. "You're not going to like this," Ethan said. Inside were records, bank transfers, hotel reservations, and more evidence that Elena's affairs had been deeper than he'd imagined. Some of the money had come from their joint account, siphoned off in small amounts to fund her double life. Lucas felt sick. How could she do this? Ethan shook his head. "You've got a choice to make, Lucas. You can confront her again, or you can walk away." Chapter 17. A Final Attempt. That evening, Lucas returned home with the file in hand. He found Elena in the living room, staring at their wedding photo on the mantel. "I found out more," Lucas said, dropping the file on the coffee table. "You've been stealing from me, too." Elena's face crumpled as she looked through the evidence. "Lucas, I'm so sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." "You keep saying that," Lucas said bitterly. "But how can I believe you?" "I'll give you everything," she said. "The passwords, the accounts. I'll go to therapy twice a week. Please, Lucas, I can't lose you." As the weeks passed, Lucas watched Elena's attempts at redemption with a skeptical eye. She attended therapy, closed her second phone account, and made every effort to regain his trust. But the cracks in their relationship ran deep. Every glance, every word felt heavy with the weight of what had happened. Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that he was living with a stranger. One morning, Lucas packed a bag and left a note on the kitchen counter. "I need time to figure out who I am without you," it read. "Don't contact me. I'll reach out if I'm ready." He drove to a small cabin in the mountains, far from the chaos of the city. There, he began the process of healing, piecing together the fragments of his life. Months later, Lucas returned to the city, stronger and more certain of himself. Elena had respected his wishes, giving him the space he needed. They met at a cafe, their conversation tentative but honest. "I still love you," Elena said, "but I understand if you can't come back." Lucas looked at her, his heart torn. Could he rebuild what had been broken, or was it time to let go? The house felt hollow, though it was still filled with people. To Lucas, the silence was deafening, like a vacuum that pulled at his sanity. After their last conversation, where he had revealed the second set of evidence, Elena had stopped trying to defend herself. She had simply fallen to her knees, tears streaming down her face, but her sorrow stirred nothing in him. "I can't do this anymore," he said quietly, his voice steady but heavy with finality. Elena looked up at him, her face contorted in despair. "You're leaving me?" "I'm leaving," he said, his tone flat. "This is no longer a home. It's just a place where I lost everything I cared about." He stood and walked out of the room, leaving Elena in the dim light of the living room, her sobs echoing faintly behind him. Weeks passed. Lucas had moved into a small apartment in a quieter part of the city. Every time he stepped into his new home, he felt the weight of emptiness pressing against him. His days became mechanical. Work, short walks, attempts to distract himself with books or television. Despite his efforts, memories of Elena haunted him. The smell of her perfume, the sound of her laughter, the warmth of her presence, they invaded his solitude at every turn. But now, those memories were tainted, darkened by the knowledge of her betrayals. One evening, while organizing the last of his belongings, he came across a box of photos from their early years. A particular picture caught his eye, their honeymoon in Santorini, Elena laughing as she leaned against him, the ocean sparkling behind them. His chest tightened. He tore the photo in half, then into smaller pieces until it was nothing more than a pile of fragments scattered across the floor. Elena, meanwhile, was spiraling. After Lucas left, the house felt cold and lifeless. She tried to focus on work, but her mind wandered, consumed by guilt and regret. The people she had betrayed Lucas for, Victor and Andrew, had both distanced themselves, leaving her utterly alone. One night, she sat in the middle of their once cozy living room, surrounded by the remnants of their life together. Their wedding photos sat on the coffee table, the glass cracked from where she had dropped it days earlier. "I ruined everything," she whispered to no one. Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands. Lucas' life continued in its monotonous pattern, but the pain refused to fade. One night, as he walked through the city, he passed a familiar bar, the place where Elena and Victor had been photographed together. He paused, staring at the neon sign glowing faintly in the drizzle. Without thinking, he stepped inside. The air was warm and filled with chatter, but all Lucas could hear was his own heartbeat. He sat at the bar, ordered a whiskey, and downed it in one gulp. As the alcohol burned its way down, he realized he wasn't there for closure. He was there to punish himself, to sit in the very place where his marriage had started to crumble. Weeks turned into months. Lucas's friends urged him to move on, to let go of the past and start fresh. But each time he tried, something held him back, a lingering sense of betrayal, an unwillingness to trust again. Elena reached out occasionally, leaving messages on his phone. Her voice sounded smaller each time, pleading for a chance to talk, to explain, to fix what had been broken. One evening, Lucas finally answered. "I don't hate you, Elena," he said, his voice calm but distant. "But I can't love you anymore either. Whatever we had is gone." Her silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Elena's life unraveled completely after that call. She lost focus at work, and her performance suffered. Eventually, she was let go from her position. The house, once a symbol of their shared dreams, became a tomb of memories she couldn't escape. One night, she found herself sitting in the darkened bedroom, clutching one of Lucas's old shirts. She closed her eyes, letting the scent of him wash over her. "I'm sorry," she whispered into the empty room. I'm so sorry. Lucas, meanwhile, found himself at a turning point. During a visit to the mountains, he stood at the edge of a serene lake, the cool air filling his lungs. For the first time in months, he felt a flicker of peace. He realized then that forgiveness wasn't for Elena, it was for himself. Holding on to anger and pain only kept him tethered to the past. Upon returning to the city, Lucas sent Elena a letter. It wasn't an apology or an invitation to reconnect. It was an acknowledgement of their shared history and an affirmation that he was ready to move forward. I hope you find peace, it read. I'm working on finding mine. Elena sold the house shortly after receiving Lucas's letter. She moved to a smaller apartment on the other side of town, where she could start anew. Though the guilt never fully left her, she began to rebuild her life, piece by fragile piece. Lucas, too, moved on. He left the city for good, choosing to start over in a place where the shadows of his past couldn't reach him. Years later, Lucas sat on the porch of his cottage, watching the sun rise over a quiet valley. A woman emerged from the house, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She handed one to him with a smile, her eyes warm and full of life. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" she said. Lucas nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. For the first time in years, the weight in his chest was gone. It wasn't the life he had envisioned, but it was his, and that was enough.